Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the NHS England Public Board meeting. My name is Penny Dash, and I am Chair of the Board. Before we get started into the material of the board, I'm going to have all of my colleagues introduce themselves, and then I'll say a few words of welcome. Andrew?
Andrew Morris, Deputy Chair.
Louise Ansari, Non-Executive Director.
Paul Dinkin, Director General for Strategy and Healthcare Policy.
David Bennett, Non-Executive Director.
Hello, Sarah Jane Marsh, National Director of UEC and Operations for now.
Robert Leckler, Non-Executive Director.
Megan Appandid, National Medical Director.
Jeremy Townsend, Non-Executive Director.
Rob Checkitts, Comms and Engagement.
Mark Cubbin, Director of Plan Care.
Amanda Doyle, National Director for Primary Care and Community Services.
Danny Mortimer, Director General of People.
Jules Hunt, Interim Director General, Technology, Digital and Data.
Glenn Burley, Financial Reset and Accountability Director.
Fiona Bride, Director General, Commercial and Growth.
Sam Everington, Non-Executive Director. David Probert, Deputy Chief Executive and Interim Director General.
Ravi Gurumurthy, Non-Executive Director.
Claire Fuller, Medical Director and Lead for Neighbourhood Health.
Paul Colligan, Non-Executive Director.
Duncan Burton, Chief Nursing Officer for England.
Mark Bailey, Non-Executive Director.
Elizabeth O'Mahony, Director General Finance.
Jim Mackey, Chief Exec.
Great, thank you all very much. So, a few words of introduction and welcome. We don't have any apologies today, which is great. It is David Probert's last meeting, so I'd particularly like to say thank you, David, for all the help and support that you've given to Jim and all of us over the last year, and good luck as you refocus back at base. Escape, exactly. Do we have any declarations of interest over and above those that are already published? No? Okay, thank you very much. And I would just like to share, so we have a wonderful gentleman, Bren, just to embarrass him, who turns up to all of our meetings in public, who's sitting here in the audience today, who's been doing a great job of giving me feedback about these meetings, which I very much appreciate. And a few consistent themes that come up. One is that we do have a real tendency to use acronyms. We are not good at that. We know that. I think we are all becoming conscious of it, but we need to be super conscious of it. So I will try hard, and I would ask all of my colleagues to try hard to use straightforward language rather than continually shortening things. I think that would feel very positive and very helpful to members of the public who are listening in. We do need to recognise that everybody in this room and our 1.5 million colleagues across the NHS work in difficult circumstances for quite a lot of the time. We are asking people to provide fantastic quality care at a time when sometimes it can feel difficult to do that. We are all working on that. We'll have a whole set of conversations today about the work that's taking place, but we do need to recognise, and I know that all of our colleagues do, that people are putting in a lot of hard work, and we really thank them for that. I think that's really important. At the same time, we want to be looking at what are we doing in a constructive way, where are there opportunities for improvement, and we will do that as we go through the material today, both looking at where there are those opportunities, but also what we are doing to positively change things and how we are going to know that things are getting better. So that a whole theme of the meeting today. Lots of other things that Bren is sharing. I won't go through all of that, otherwise we'd be here for a while, but thank you, Bren, for that, and I look forward to more feedback from today's meeting. It is appreciated. On to the substantive items. The first one is the minutes from the last meeting on the 5th of February. Does anybody have any comments on those? Okay, so we'll take those as read and approved. The next item is updates from the various board subcommittees. So I'd like to ask colleagues, particularly the committee chairs and exec colleagues, to share updates from those. As a move from last time, we have asked for those to be a bit more comprehensive, to share a bit more of the meat of the conversation, again, for full transparency. So I'm going to start with the People Committee and with Louise.
Thank you, Chair. So, yes, more detailed than previously.
Only a couple of things I'd like to pull out really, and one is the oversight we've got on the voluntary redundancy programme, which obviously I'm getting a weekly update on that, and Jim and colleagues are working hard to ensure that staff are cared for through the process, and actually a lot of staff in NHS England are leaving in fact this week, and a number are leaving in June, and obviously I'm sure Jim and everybody wants to thank those staff for their fantastic service during their time at NHS England. One of the issues that we talked about, and I think Mark is also raising this in his committee paper, is about the need to retain the right capability, particularly in the digital data and technology team, and perhaps Mark might want to raise that as well as part of his committee update. And at the next meeting, we're going to be looking at workforce planning against the business plan for NHS England, and trying to have oversight of having the right stuff in the right jobs for the business plan for the coming year. Sarah Jane Marsh is now overseeing the Improving NHS England Together organisational culture programme, and we had an update from her. We looked at statutory mandatory training, some really interesting analysis of statutory mandatory training sort of mandated from the centre that isn't actually showing a huge amount of evidence that it is improving outcomes for people. So we're doing lots more work on that to see what statutory mandatory training is absolutely necessary, and we are increasing the frequency of our meetings of the People Committee, and we've got one coming up in a few weeks' time.
That's great, thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Louise?
Just to build on, I really accept the challenges. I take on some new responsibilities around the talent management and the identification of people, the ones that really do the work in this organisation that sit at the tiers, the next couple of tiers from here. We need to be providing really clear opportunities for those people to be both aligned to our purpose and our priorities and our values, but also to keep their energy really high in what we know will be a challenging time that you alluded to, Penny. So that's going to be one of the key priorities over the next few weeks. That will be our success or not, won't it, over the next year, really, is our ability to be able to keep those people energised and aligned.
Yeah, agree, and thank you for taking on that work. Robert?
Two quick questions. One is under talent and appointments. I think we talked in the past about some training for non-executive directors on boards, which I think could be very useful to maximise their effectiveness. I'm not sure if that's happening. The other is, I'm not sure this is the right place to raise this, but we agreed some time ago to appoint a professional experience as an executive on this board, reporting, I think, directly to Jim. It seems to have been slow. Just an update on how that appointment is progressing.
Well, thank you, Robert, for raising that. I've been raising it possibly twice weekly with Duncan and others, and I'm sure Duncan will have an update on that in terms of the Director of Patient Experience, because that really does need to be got out there for recruitment. I know that the job description has been completed, and then the point about non-exec director and chair development in the system. There's a big piece of work going on that, and of course there is the setting up of the NHS Leadership College, which is progressing. So that is certainly a priority that the committee will be looking at. I don't know, Duncan, if you want to address the former point.
Well, we should. The new patient experience director role should be out to advert, I am promised, by the end of next week. So calculate that when it comes out.
Good. We look forward to that. Great. Okay, let's move on to strategy. David?
Thank you. So the focus of the committee continues to be on four things. So first of all, making sure we really understand what is going on across both NHS England and the department in terms of strategy and policy work, and making sure that each of the projects has a steering committee or equivalent that is overseeing the work in advance of it coming to the board for decision. And so for the strategy committee itself, we identified 14 projects which we will be overseeing, and in the paper in the appendix there's a list of those 14 topics. So that's the first thing. Secondly, We are in the process of agreeing a standardised model for how we do this strategy and policy work. That's partly about making sure we have consistent quality in the work, partly about making sure that all the interdependencies, there are a huge number of interdependencies, are being addressed and coordinated, make sure we're appropriately prioritising all this work and making effective use of our resources. We discussed at our last meeting a draft paper on this proposed model, and this is now being subject to more detailed review amongst the executive team. So the second thing. Third thing is looking at the development of an overarching model that pulls all of this together so that we have a real understanding of what it is we're aiming for with the 10-year plan in a more quantitative sense. Ultimately, of course, it's all about the impact on patients, but then how that translates into financial impact, staff numbers, and all the other things that go into this. And again, we're in the process of developing this, and in fact, we'll be discussing it a bit later today. And then finally, we've been reviewing some of those 14 projects that we have chosen for the strategy committee to look at ourselves, and those that we looked at our last meeting also listed in the paper.
Okay, great, thank you. I think probably also worthwhile saying we have also managed to get a few things out the door, like the women's health strategy. Yes. I think was published just as one example of things.
Just pending publications.
Oh, sorry, pending publication. Right,
in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, yeah, I've been hearing mixed. So, because I saw the Secretary of State's speech yesterday referred to it in 2 weeks' time, but then I was at a meeting yesterday when someone told me that it had been published.
No, it's due to be.
Okay, all right. Okay. Any questions for David? Okay, great. Jolly good. The next one is a new subcommittee of the board, which I am chairing, so I have to talk to this myself. So this is a new group we've set up called the Research, Innovation and Growth Board. And the purpose of that was to ensure that we had closer alignment to the life sciences sector delivery plan, which is a key piece of work that was published last year, and to ensure that we are delivering against our side of the objectives within that, but also to very much embrace the wider commercial and innovation agenda, which Fiona is currently leading on, to ensure that we are giving sufficient focus to research, but also that we are supporting the health innovation networks and a much wider group of organisations and colleagues focused on innovation out there in the system. So it's a fairly broad agenda, but also feels like a crucial agenda for a number of elements of the 10-year plan, as well as the wider areas that I've referred to. The first meeting focused on terms of reference, membership, the title of the group, looked at how we are clearer on accountabilities from that life sciences sector plan, but also reflected on things like an interesting meeting that was held with a number of med tech companies who at times find it quite difficult to ensure that the latest innovations and products are safely and sensibly and in a financially robust way adopted into the NHS. So we talked about the links between that and the modern service frameworks, which we will be coming on to talk about shortly. I think overall sense was it was a good meeting. We are going to have regular updates from the NHS genomics programme, which is a key bit, again, of innovation and forward-looking. And we'll start to put together a list of topics that we'll be discussing over the forthcoming months. Any questions, comments?
Just a comment. I mean, I think it was a very good meeting, and it's great that it's taken shape. I think it'll be important to define some metrics of what we should be measuring, and I've arranged to meet with Lucy Chappell, the Director General, to get my thoughts in shape, which I'll then share with you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, good. Let's go on to digital and data then.
So good meeting broadly separated into two areas. One, cyber and resilience, and the second is delivering digital change across the system. In terms of cyber and resilience, pushing very hard on really driving through the resilience programme that started 18 months ago and making sure that the critical national infrastructure is where it should be, and the teams are making good progress, and this is sort of long, diligent work. And then also making sure we can respond to any cyber incident if it ever happened, and progress is now being made on a national test of what we would do in that situation and making sure we can actually respond effectively. And there's been some good progress over the last week. To Louise's point, one of the concerns is we have lost people in this area due to the VR programme, and the team are going back through just to make sure we have the right resources in the right places. And then on delivering digital change, really good progress by the team on what we would actually do and sort of turning the aspiration of the 10-year plan into actual delivery plans and things we would accelerate. I think there's a few things that come out of it. One, the resourcing issue pops back, that we're going to have to make some prioritisation decisions because we don't have the headcount we did. Two, we need, as you move from sort of technology that sits nationally to experience that cuts through the system on a patient basis, we need to find much closer alignment with the operations in the business and having people who are sort of, in a traditional business, the chief product owner for urgent and emergency care. And I think Paul's doing some great work on that, and we can actually see real progress over the last 3 months in terms of how people are addressing it. And then finally, we've finished off the work finding the permanent leadership for the area, which is good, which hopefully will be resolved in the next few weeks.
Okay, great. Any questions? Nope. Okay, so then, Luke, let's move on. So the next 3 committees have all met recently, so that's why we don't have a write-up, but we're going to have a verbal update. So Audit and Risk Committee, Jeremy?
Yeah, so we had our second joint meeting with the department. One of the key risks that we're looking at is the whole transition risk, and focusing on the date in particular. There's a risk that the legislation's in process at the moment, and there's no plan to move the date, but there's a risk the date may move, and so we need a contingency plan around that date being delayed, and if the date was to be delayed, what would be the best next best date. So that contingency plan's being worked up. There's a similar but asymmetric risk that the legislation does take place on the date, but all the responsibilities or all of the issues relating to transition haven't been fully resolved. And we need to identify what those risks are and what the mitigation plans and contingency plans are around that. So the team working on the transition are working on those contingency plans, and we're going to pick that up at our next joint meeting. The joint meeting also looked at the respective risk registers of the department and NHS England. They're quite different, but not incompatible. NHS, the department tends to be looking out more at national risks around resilience. The NHS England is more looking at how the NHS delivers its issues, but there wasn't anything that was of concern. We'll continue to run those separately, but review them together. Within the NHS England Audit Committee, our key issue, we talked about the cyber resilience exercise, and it's great to hear that's picking up. We appreciate, as we move towards transition, there may be a more challenged control environment, particularly in the VR situation as well. And what we felt at the committee,
we should keep saying really, VR equals voluntary redundancy.
Sorry, voluntary redundancy. I told myself I should not use any TLAs, so apologies. That it was, to some extent, for Elizabeth and Jim to judge what the priorities are around control, and let's not have a situation where we're trying to cover everything and not deliver on the key issues. And I think that's probably an issue for the area as a whole. And then finally, I'll just make this plug. An issue of mine for the last 5 years has been trying to look at the accounting situation and the audit situation. We spend about £60 million auditing the trusts. Is there an easier way of delivering the accountability and the comfort that we need without doing the full-scale audits? And there's a project reset at the moment that's looking at all that, and I would hope there's an opportunity to save some money there but still deliver the accountability we'd like to deliver.
Great, thank you. Any comments, questions? Okay, let's move on to Finance and Performance Committee, Andrew.
Thanks, Penny. So we spent some time kicking the tyres on month 10 and where we've got to on month 10 and the planning round. So at month 10, it looks like the financial reset is holding, which is fabulous news, and well done to everyone. A great bit of leadership on behalf of colleagues to my right. So 67% of systems and 90% of providers are saying they're going to hit their target this year, which is, a far better position than it was this time last year, which is great to see. 8 billion has been delivered in efficiencies, and boards are gripping the money to a degree that we've not seen or experienced before. So it's looking really, really good, and we should land this. And lots of boards are putting a tremendous amount of effort. It's been a big priority in most settings around financial reset, and it's really good that some historically challenged systems have come good. So if you take colleagues in Lancs and South Cumbria, Greater Manchester, Shropshire and Staffordshire, Norfolk and Waveney, and last but not least, Shrewsbury and Telford have moved into a really good place and delivered on the numbers. So they've been troubled systems for several years, and it's really, really positive that things have come good in those settings. On the planning round, things are looking pretty good. So we've got various iterations that we're going through. So 35 out of 36 systems are saying they will hit their plan limit going forward into next year, and 133 out of 204 providers are saying they'll do the same. So again, we're in a stronger position. So if you look at where we were this time last year, we had a gap of about 4.4 bill, and it's now 1.45, and there's a bit more to do. So if you look at the where we are on delivering performance for next year, we're almost there, with systems saying that they will hit the respective targets that we've got, particularly around the constitutional standards. Efficiency is still really tough out there, and I think in some patches providers are really, really struggling. But overall, it was a great meeting and some really, really positive results. On performance, the big thing that stood out for the committee is where we've got to, which is a really bad place on life expectancy. So we are 2 years behind where we were pre-pandemic, which isn't a great place. And it's not all down to the NHS, but I think we need to be a lot clearer as a board around what is it that's within the 10-year plan that's going to give us the shift back to where we were. And I think we're quite unsighted at the moment around what those things are. So I think there's a bit of work that we've got to do as a board just to get a fix on what are the big ticket items that are going to make the shift. Because 2 years, and I'm getting involved in it, I'm 70, it means an awful lot as you get older, and all of us want to make it into our 90s potentially if we can, and that's our job in essence. So the other bit on performance was around maternity. So we've had several conversations as a board around where we've got to on maternity, which isn't a great place in some patches, and where we need to be. And I think we need a set of metrics that we can monitor as part of the performance pack. So that's something hopefully that Duncan will help us focus on going forward. The last bit was on workforce. So Danny presented the workforce plan. So we've seen some big shifts. 43% reduction in agency staff across the service, which is fantastic. Better quality care as a result, and it's cheaper. And 7% reduction in bank staff. So that's 1 billion. That's 1 billion of the 8 billion that we've delivered on efficiency. And that has to have a kind of continued focus going forward. Sickness is a worry, and that's a focus I think we'll ask Danny to come back to the committee on, because it's going the wrong way. It's at 5.6. So we're almost hitting kind of the pandemic levels of sickness that we had in the service. And it's a big issue, and I don't believe it's one that we can't resolve. I think with some really good first line management support to get on top of this around supporting individuals to come back to work, we can see that number reduced back to our target is 4.1%. And 1% of the pay bill is a lot of money. There's a lot of money there that will help us with our challenge on efficiency. So, and again, going forward, if you look at the performance pack, we've got relatively little data on where we are with people. So stuff like turnover, where we are on the workforce plan, training numbers, productivity, just tracking where we are per, consultant or activity levels per consultant or per individual members of staff. I think that's something we need to focus on. So they're the things that we covered. And a big thank you to Jim and Elizabeth on the money, because I think they have galvanised the service into getting boards to deliver, getting boards to focus on this as the number one priority, and it just gives us a bit more headroom as we go and credibility as we go into next financial year. So thank you guys, really well done.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew, for that. I think we'll get into this a little bit more as we get into the performance report. Big thank you to Elizabeth and to Jim for their leadership here. Do you want to come in on?
Yeah, just to highlight to members that it was a really good discussion. So, and it's great actually to have the NED, the quality of the NED conversation in the subcommittees. The numbers that Andrew quoted on planning were as of the February submission, and since then we've had a March submission and we've got a subsequent submission today. So I'm pleased to say to the board members, I know we'll cover this in some detail later, but the position even that Andrew quoted, which was a stark improvement from this time last year, has improved significantly again.
Okay. Great. We'll come on to quality in a minute, but just one observation, and I'm looking at Katie, who helps me with the agenda. I think just picking up on what Andrew said, it would be helpful, I think, if we started these updates with performance, where are we now, and then go into strategy. So just on those two, is our strategy helping us to address our performance? I think that should be our sequence. So for future, just a note on that, if we start with that. So quality, we had an intensive quality day yesterday with both the Quality Committee and the National Quality Board. Robert, do you want to share what we discussed?
Yes, it was. It was a quality day. And it was interesting because it was the final meeting of the Quality Committee as a freestanding entity, and we've discussed this before. The decision we took to avoid duplication and create greater efficiency was to integrate these two. For governance purposes, while NHS England exists, there needs to be a Quality Committee of this board, and so what we're going to do is have the National Quality Board, and then as a kind of part two, the Quality Committee, and we're shaping exactly what that agenda needs to look like. But yesterday we had some really interesting discussions, very important discussions. We saw the final version of the quality strategy. It needs now to go to ministerial approval, but it's a huge amount of work, a very complicated topic, discussing the three major elements of safety, effectiveness, in other words, outcomes, and patient experience. I think it's a really good document. It's got a brilliant executive summary at the front that really sets the tone. We saw the first modern service framework. These are under generation in multiple clinical pathways. The one we saw was the sepsis modern service framework, and we thought it was terrific. Really high quality piece of work, full of ambition, full of innovation. We had an interesting discussion about risk around quality, and I think what I would say is that we're in a better place because quality now is the central organising principle of the NHS, and this quality strategy, I think, makes us all safer, and added to which there's greater clarity of accountability for safety and quality through the organisation. Last thing I'll mention, we had an interesting discussion about neighbourhoods, neighbourhood health centres, and how they're going to be regulated. We didn't resolve it because it's a complicated topic, but it's one that we'll undoubtedly return to.
Okay, great. Thank you. Any comments, questions on that? Okay, good. So hopefully that gives a sense of the comprehensiveness, really, of the work that's happening and some of the depth of conversations. And key part that we're doing here overall is to ensure that all of that sits together into a coherent whole. Jim, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Penny. So there's a lot to cover today. It feels like there's an awful lot happened since we last met. So I'll try and do this quickly, and obviously colleagues just shout if there's any questions. First of all, on industrial action, I can feel the anxiety in the room about what I'm going to say about industrial action. But it's not the first time we've been sat here with the disappointment of having to look into future strikes. I'll just say, Glenn, I'm sure I'll pick this up. A fantastic amount of effort and work has gone in both sides to try and reach agreement, and we felt very, very, very close that we had a deal that could work for all parties. It's incredibly disappointing that it felt a bit at the last minute. It's actually not true. I think that our position changed during the negotiation, but we are where we are, so we're going to have to get ourselves organised about just navigating what's probably a long period now of dispute, and the NHS has managed it well in the last year. We'll have to settle ourselves into a bit of a rhythm where we're managing it as business as usual as best we can. And as I say, Glenn might want to chip in later on. We are also at that horrible time of year where you're trying to finish a year well and start and set up next year, and also increasingly set up future years as part of our medium-term planning process, as has already been mentioned a couple of times. So we're still in fighting distance on some of the key metrics. We've just had last week's elective numbers. I can't say them because I'll get into a lot of trouble. But we are inching towards getting where we need it to be, or at least very close, and also on some of the other key metrics. I think to be at this position at this time of the year, given everything that's been done, I think it's absolutely incredible for what the NHS has achieved, and colleagues here have helped lead through the year as well. Also, we'll have all seen and been involved with the horrors of the meningitis issue last week, and terrible tragedy for those that lost their lives, and the shock for the families involved, and also the staff dealing with that. I would just say as well, a lot of complexity and all that. The service really responded very, very well in a very complex set of circumstances in a fragile health system that has its challenges as well. But thanks to Sarah Jane, EPRR colleagues here, but also out there in the NHS and UXA as well, managing a very, very difficult situation. Hopefully we're coming out of the other end of that. On planning, Elizabeth mentioned this, we are now close to having a path that can work next year. We've got a bit of work to do on those that have stubborn problems. Has had a bit of coverage this week. We'll talk about improvement later on. And we've got a session on Monday now with chief execs of NPIP organisations, where we can have a discussion about how we transition into this new approach that was announced by Secretary of State yesterday as well. And in all of this, we've just had a good discussion before the meeting about the tension between delivering day to day, grinding through results as best we can, but making the big leaps, the big steps that we need to make going through this next year, and accelerating our rate of progress. So I think boards, spend a bit of time on this in the next few weeks to just think about where we can best help bring that to life for colleagues out there. And then also just to quickly rattle through, as I've said earlier on, as Andrew's mentioned, the delivery on the money this year, being within fighting distance on the key metrics, given where we are now, getting through industrial action through the year, managing winter, 10-year plan, and then very importantly, British Social Attitude Survey results this week. Not perfect, still a lot to do, still things in that we would be unhappy about, but a big improvement after 2 really dreadful years of decline. And then just very finally, as again has already been mentioned, we've got a lot of colleagues leaving here. ICBs are the part of the service. Some have already left. I've said goodbye to colleagues I've known and worked with for 30 odd years. I met a colleague yesterday here who really wanted to end a long career well, feeling good about their work the organisation, their contribution to the NHS, and we should really acknowledge this is a huge change. And there's a lot of individuals, a lot of people involved, and we can't lose sight of that through a pretty difficult process. So I would like to thank them all for what they've done, their patience through a pretty messy year, horrible process of trying to reach agreement for voluntary redundancy. But hopefully now everyone can move on to this next stage. So big thanks from me and I'm sure others in the board. And then we've got a bit of a change going on in execs, obviously, as well, as was shared last week with colleagues coming and going. And again, just thank David for everything he's done when we took him hostage last year to make a contribution. We've got another part of the hostage release scheme going on over the next few months as colleagues go back. None of this will join, so a good few jobs will be advertised in the next few weeks to demonstrate this is more sustainable, making permanent recruitment choices about the future as well. So that'll power up in this next couple of weeks. So it's been a really busy year. Really incredibly busy last few weeks. What's the thing with this that makes it good but also really painful is you're never done. There's never an easy point ahead. But I think we should absolutely acknowledge, recognise and congratulate what the NHS has managed to deliver in a pretty difficult year.
Okay. Glenn, did you want to come back in on the strikes?
Yeah, if I may. I mean, just to echo Jim's comments there, incredibly disappointed that we've reached this point. We put forward what I feel is a really good offer to resident doctors. Huge amount of work from Megan and I and other colleagues in the negotiating team, and actually from the negotiating team of the BMA. So we pulled together a really good joint proposal that covered jobs, pay, wider contract reforms. And every single issue that was put to us, we addressed through a rather large document that came together for that. So when the BMA negotiating team put it to their committee, I was really shocked that the committee decided not to even put it to their members. So as a result of that, we will seek to put the details of it into the public domain, because I think it's important the resident doctors see the lengths that we have gone to address their concerns, and for the wider NHS actually to see that, but also to see what we're going to lose as a result. And one of the immediate things is we were about to recruit to 1,000 new trading posts, and to see that not moving forward is really disappointing.
Yeah, so there's a loss to the resident doctor community, as you say, and you're going to publish that then?
So we will share the wider offer, including some of the contractual improvements that we were suggesting.
Okay, but there's also obviously a loss to our patients, our users and their families, and indeed to the other staff, because I'm noting that these strikes will be over the holiday period again. Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really disappointing for patients. I mean, this is at a point where we know we'll be at a busy stage again, so it feels like it's kind of trying to push maximum harm onto patients, but we will make sure that doesn't happen as an NHS. But also all the other colleagues in the NHS who will step in and cover for resident doctors. It's hard for them also.
Yeah. Okay.
And not just on that, Penny. So we'll stand up the usual arrangements next week to prepare as we usually do. We've treated every strike so far as though it's the last one, and really, I think, managed to really mitigate the impact on patients to a significant degree. We want to keep that going as best we can, but we have to acknowledge that we can't have people just disrupting their leave every few weeks and being able to get on with their lives. So there's a balance we've now got to strike. If we assume we're now in at least a mid-distance run rather than a sprint, it's probably long distance if we're honest. So we've got to get ourselves organised to be able to sustain that over a long period of time.
Yeah. So I think we will need to see what that means.
Yeah.
How do we move into a different way of working that sustains this, as you say?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, very, very disappointing. Thank you. I know many people around this table put in a lot of time to it, and we'll see where we get to. And also to echo, Jim, the thanks to the many colleagues who will be leaving us through the voluntary redundancy programme for their work over in some cases, over many years. Okay, let's go on to the wider performance report. David?
Thank you, Chair. And really just to begin in the way that Jim just ended there by thanking colleagues across the NHS for all of their hard work as we approach the end of this year, and I give a performance report which looks really at the month of February predominantly, but I'll try and touch on just a couple of other points that we know of towards the end of this year. So you'll see in this report we've done a couple of things. Firstly, we've included a summary of performance, so I won't go into things in great detail, but we've also added 6 more areas that the board had talked to us about over previous meetings. So community weights as a proportion of 52-week weights by region, child and young adult community weights split by specialty, healthy life expectancy both by male and female, emergency admissions for over 65s, and then the estimates of potentially avoidable emergency admissions. So I'll just summarise in brief form, maybe in 3 categories, those areas where we've seen improved performance, and particularly over the course of this report, so looking back on February, areas where we have perhaps faced a little bit more challenge, and then finally just where we are in the month of February on some of those key access targets that we know and talk about an awful lot across the NHS. So firstly, on improved performance, you will see that we continue to see improving performance, small numbers, but improving performance in a big area of focus, which is adult inpatients with autism or learning disability reducing, and that's a very positive reflection of the good work that's taking place across the NHS. You will see a number of improvements in areas of screening, cervical, breast, bowel, where we are seeing small upticks of improvement against, again, metrics which are further away, and that's the way, of course, it works with screening, but it's positive to see those improvements. Continued improvements in mental health beds out of area, which we know from a patient and family experience is particularly important, as is crisis care, face-to-face contact within 24 hours, where we're seeing an improvement in the amount of people that are able to access that vitally important care. We talked a couple of meetings ago around the importance of prevention being highlighted, so it's positive to see some of the good work and improvement in areas of hypertension and cholesterol management, which has continued to see a year-on-year improvement, and the statistics are there, and obviously predominantly provided by our colleagues in primary care, so important to reflect the good work that we're seeing there. And then finally, continuing healthcare, 28-day completion, we improved again an upwards of 1.3%, which again shows the sort of broader look at the way we're managing healthcare pathways. So a number of key areas where we're seeing improvement. As I said, I'll come on at the end just to talk about some of the key access targets. There are a number of areas, Andrew's already touched on them, and Jim a little, that we are still reporting as challenging. Healthy life expectancy, already discussed, is probably the most significant of those. As you can see, that continues to decline, and is an area that outside of this meeting we've discussed looking at a deeper dive into and perhaps bringing back to board in a lot more detail. And I think we're looking at commissioning colleagues externally to help us with some expertise and advice in understanding this. MMR vaccination rates, we reported at the last board that our uptake remains below the World Health Organization thresholds, and therefore posing a continued outbreak risk. Given what we've seen, a very different issue, of course, but with meningitis, one hopes that public awareness is heightened again, and we need to use that opportunity to talk about the absolute value of vaccination. But at the moment, those rates are still standing at about 83.5%, so below where we need them to be. Community mental health satisfaction rates has seen a very slight decline over the period of this time, and you can see across 2 of our main core cancer targets, the faster diagnostic standard and also the 62-day target, small declines over that Christmas period. But what I would say, having managed cancer performance for many, many years, it is always challenging when you pick up after the Christmas period, because just by the very nature of activity over that period, there tends to be a bit of a dip. There are a number of other targets highlighted, and just to a point that I think Andrew was raising earlier around staff engagement and experience, we've tried to include a number of areas which picked out of the staff survey most recently, and disappointingly a couple of those I've seen a small decline, raising concerns being one, always being a learning organisation, and then finally, probably most significant for NHS providers like mine, we look at the engagement theme score, which has seen a small dip in the reported details from last time. So just finally on the key performance indicators, again, we're really looking at February and in some instances for elective and cancer at January here, so a little bit of a look back. But you can see that UAC attendances over that month continue to rise. You can see from the data that there is improvement in our 4-hour target, and as Jim mentioned, the most recent data would suggest good improvement in that area, but of course we still have some way to go before the end of the financial year. And the percentage of patients spending over 12 hours in ED from arrival, again, we're starting to improve only by a few percent, but that's all important when we think about the numbers that equates to in terms of patient experience. On elective, as Jim has mentioned, all colleagues across the NHS are working incredibly hard to make sure our patients can be looked after and we can achieve the target that's set. The January figures show a decreasing waiting list position against the month previous and the month last year, and we are continuing to make good progress on long waiters over 52 weeks, certainly against the previous months and the previous year. You'll see some improvements in cancer when we look back on a year's progress, which again is important when you're looking at large-scale change, and then finally minimal change in areas like diagnostics, but that's probably reflected better in the overall cancer targets. So we await the end of this year, the good work that people are reporting, and that will be reported, I think, probably, Penny, in the next board meeting. But very happy to take questions, and as always, conscious my expert colleagues are sat around the table to redirect them.
Thank you, David. So I think just to take us back to the point Andrew started off on life expectancy, as you said about, you mentioned commissioning a piece of work. I think given there's quite a big focus of this in the quality strategy, it's important that it does link to that quality strategy. I was also kind of raised, though, that yes, primary prevention, wider determinants of health will be critical around improving life expectancy, but how we manage people with illness, so particularly with diabetes, with cardiovascular disease, is absolutely crucial. And our metrics on those are pretty poor, to be blunt. I mean, they're quite consistently below 50%. So that feels like that should really be a big area of focus. So I'm not necessarily saying to respond to it now, but that's the bit that jumps off the page, and hopefully the modern service frameworks will help to address some of that, but I'm not quite sure all. So I just wonder whether we could keep quite relentlessly looking at that and maybe even adding a bit more. I had a question about the 11 trusts with relatively high standardised mortality rates. What do we then do when we see that? And then my final one was, given all of this, should we start to measure which would essentially bring together everything across performance, what level of healthcare value we are achieving? So are we spending our money on the most impactful interventions to deliver improvements in life expectancy and quality of life? Maybe that comes out of the piece of work and out of the quality strategy, but that might be something that we could have a go at, having an overarching, almost score ourselves on how well we're doing on that, just as a thought. So those are a few from me, but let's take a few others that we go around. So I've got Ravi, and then Sam, and then Robert, and then Louise.
Thank you. There's a couple of slides on the variation in performance. So the 12-hour performance and ambulance wait times. I just wondered, how stable are the bottom 10 providers? Are they there for a long period of time? Second, do we have enough granular data to understand what is driving that variation, such that we can take some actionable steps with them? And then thirdly, are we providing that intensive accountability and support to try and address them?
Okay, great. Sam?
It's on your theme, Penny, of healthy life expectancy. Figures I've seen by 2040 is the healthy life expectancy between rich and poor is going to be 20 years different. So in deprived areas, like some of the areas I work, you can expect to hit chronic disease at 50. If you're in a wealthier area, it will be the age of 70. It would be really nice to have that within some of the data, not just to highlight it, but also actually that will help us tease down, as Penny rightly says, what's within our gift to change and what isn't. And for those things that are not within our gift, actually, how do we land them in other parts of the system in order to get some way forward? And then on the MMR thing, which has been a struggle over many years, there has been times where we've been much more successful. What sort of learning are we doing from international comparators? In other words, what are they doing in other systems that are getting the higher rates?
Okay. Robert?
Yeah, no, it's really helpful report, David, and some very positive things. But I wanted to zone in on hypertension. So, I mean, two of the biggest killers are cancer and cardiovascular. And one obvious preventive measure is blood pressure control. So there is a slight improvement, I accept that. But if you accept that 33% of hypertension goes undiagnosed in the community, and if 50% of that that's diagnosed is inadequately managed, that means about 50% of people with blood pressure are not being properly treated. So there's a really attractive target if we want to shift the dial, and it's something that I would hope neighbourhood health centres will zone in on. So I just wanted to ensure there was no complacency about blood pressure, because it's such a big problem and a soluble one, I think.
Please.
So, Jim, you mentioned the British Social Attitude Survey and the slight uptick there in satisfaction, which is really good news after so many years of it being so low and declining again. However, it is the actual satisfaction total is still very low, isn't it? And what we've got in terms of the experience metrics, there's only 4 metrics in experience, and we've discussed this a few times, haven't we? Is that when you ask people what matters to them most about how satisfied they are with the NHS, they say access to services, A&E waits, and how people are communicated with by the NHS. And what we still don't have here are any metrics around communication and how easy it is to kind of navigate the NHS. So I know Duncan and the new Director of Patient Experience will have plans around that, but I really feel like we should be speeding that up so we get a really clear picture of experience. And equally on GP access, I've seen it has improved a little bit, which is great, but again, people still feel that is a significantly difficult thing to do. So I know Amanda has been doing a phenomenal job with GPs to improve that through the contracts and other measures, but we need to keep up the momentum on that and a focus on that in order for that to continue to improve over the next year.
Paul?
I just wanted to go back to what you said earlier, Penny, about the relationship between strategy and performance. All of this discussion around healthy life expectancy, reducing inequalities in healthy life expectancy, that is our core job. That is what our strategy should be aimed at. And as we look through how we're doing from a performance perspective, all of those things are inputs and outputs towards that goal. So I would just say, I think it relates very, very strongly to the work we're doing to try and get ourselves with a kind of outcomes-focused view on 10-year plan delivery. If we feel like we need to go out for additional support on some technical analysis somewhere, then we should have that discussion. But actually, this is our core job, and I'm keen to make sure that we're actually owning and doing that work properly internally. I think it links also some discussions we've had with the Chief Medical Officer about how we understand how we are doing as a health system at any one point, which I think comes back to your point about value as well. So just a strong push to hold ourselves, my director, to account for being able to, I think, lead that work, and we can discuss how we join up best to do it.
Okay, so I've got Amanda and then Claire, and then we'll head back to David.
So just on, I think it's Robert's point about hypertension, one of the things we are doing to try to increase our identification of undiagnosed hypertension is giving open access to pharmacies for testing, and pharmacies this year have significantly overachieved on the numbers we expected to see, so that's quite positive. We obviously need to work at translating that into better managed hypertension. On Louisa's point, the Health Insight Survey that the ONS do for us every 4 weeks, which isn't big enough to give us the degree of detail at very local level, but gives us information very frequently, does ask a question about, are you on an NHS waiting list? How happy are you with the communication you receive? And does give us some insight. Not particularly positive, but it does.
Okay. Claire?
Thank you. So we build on the importance of the management of long-term conditions. So the longer you can stop people from collecting more long-term conditions and ending up with multiple long-term conditions, the more we will increase their healthy life expectancy. Yep. So the thing we haven't talked about is, well, the Neighbourhood Health Framework was published last week. And within that, we've actually, one of the main aims of that is to improve the management of long-term conditions for people. So we've got the 8-step care processes with an aim to increase the performance of that by 10%. And we'll continue to focus on hypertension and in particular case finding. So we've got, using our usual assurance mechanism, we're doing some work with the regional medical directors on current performance of 8-step care processes. So I would hope that we would start to see that pick up, but there will be a lag.
Okay, I hope so. Megan.
Thank you. Just about your question on the mortality rates.
Yes.
So the summarised hospital mortality index, which looks at deaths within hospital and also deaths 30 days after discharge. So the organisations in this report, I have discussed with the regional medical directors, and they assure me that all these trusts have robust mortality governance processes. They have looked at the specific conditions that have led to the rise in SHMI, Summary Hospital Mortality Index, and where necessary, they have undertaken quality improvement work, such as introducing care bundles, say for pneumonia care. They have also, where necessary, if the structured judgment reviews, which are undertaken for all deaths in hospitals, where they've found there would be a likely reason that this could have been avoidable, they have gone on to investigate it further as a patient safety incident. And there are some hospitals where there are issues with regard to the change in the data set, because the same-day emergency care data is no longer included in the denominator. And that is not currently the situation for all trusts. So we need to look at that as well, separately.
Okay, thank you. Very helpful. So, David, just coming back to you. I think there were questions both about the what. What are we measuring, and this is work in progress, and I think there's still some hints on that. But the big one that's come up actually is around variation. And are we actually showing enough in these pages on the variation, and then how are we tackling that variation?
No, absolutely. So I'll take the variation theme away with the team. Sarah J might want to come on particularly on the UEC side of variation. And also just a couple of other quick responses. So I'll think with healthy life expectancy, as Sam's point, we see, for example, cancer set by deprivation. So there must be other ways in which we can bring that data together, at least the bits that we have, because I think it's a really important challenge for us all. And then just to Louisa's point around communication, again, whether it's maternity, inpatient or cancer, communication surveys are really live and real, and we can see that on a pathway basis. So how might we bring subsets of that, if not the holistic, until the new patient experience lead comes in? But maybe Sarah Jane, do you want to pick up Ravi's point around variation and the granulation of the data on 12-hour waits?
Absolutely. So on this issue of stability versus the is it always the same people? Broadly, yes, although we do see some really heroic leaps out of the bottom group. And we've actually seen this year some people go from the bottom to almost the top performing in a single year because they've really driven the transformation. We do know why. In all of the organisations that are poor performing on the metrics, it's always a combination of systems and process issues coupled with culture and leadership that's not tackling them in the way that's needed. Our interventions help and support to look at both. I think in terms of what we do, we've got a time-limited offer, principally led by GIRF, the Getting It Right First Time team that exists to drive out clinical variation, but we're increasingly then aligning the metrics that they are looking at and looking at the improvement with the national oversight framework. So we're really clear about the way that we are rating and ranking trusts and our expectations on board for improvement. We have actually, if you take the ambulance one as an example, massively narrowed the gap. So we used to have a much bigger variation between our best and our poor performers, and we've concentrated a lot of our energy on getting those the tail to get closer to the middle group, and that has worked quite well in ambulance services. We've got a way to go, I think, on things like 4 and 12 hours, but it's an important balance, I think, and one always for conversation about how much you support versus how much you hold to account. So we're trying to get that balance of time-limited support, opportunity, and then the sort of escalation via the accountability framework.
Thanks, Sarah. And there was one final point just around MMR and learning from international comparators. I don't know whether Amanda...
Yeah, just before that though, David, so it's a bit about showing the variation in performance across, as we were just talking about, urgent and emergency care. But I think there's also variation in performance across the quality metrics.
Yes.
So I'm always very conscious that that average, whether it's for hypertension management, cholesterol management, diabetes management, the average belies a very significant variation underneath. So I think if we could see some of that, the scale of variation, and then similarly have this conversation, what are we doing with the people, the organisations that are really under-delivering?
We'll look into that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Did you want to mention MMR?
So we're still off where we need to be around MMR delivery to children. We have made some changes in the GP contract that come into force next week to particularly support general practice in areas where it's very, very challenging to deliver the coverage that we need to see. So some extra incentive to shift the dial up a bit. International comparison's difficult where you see there are some places where there are sort of rules around school entry, for example, but this is a challenge not just in this country.
Okay, thank you. Elizabeth, did you want to come back on finance over and above what Andrew said?
A couple of brief points, if I may. So thank you. Job's done. Thank you, Andrew. That's excellent. So we are, the reports at month 10, we have actually got month 11 numbers in now, so they're tracking. So we move from a small overspend in aggregate of 71 million to a small surplus at this point of the year, 30 million. So we're on track. We're definitely not complacent as an NHS. Not just a finance community. You always hold your nerve at this time of the year as we're working through things. But just to let members know, we also did a month 9 exercise that we reported through ARAC, which is effectively a dry run for the year-end accounts. So we did that at month 9. And any issues that we have identified, we've effectively then worked through those in advance of the year end. So I'm expecting a smoother audit and a smoother process, which effectively means we're hoping to bring our timetable forward in terms of laying our accounts before Parliament, etc. Since COVID, they have been delayed quite significantly, so we're pulling that back. The numbers are in the report, so from a perspective of system performance, it's a £428 million deficit. 15 systems are off plan currently. I guess the thing I would want to pull out that, just to elaborate on what Andrew described, was of the 14 systems, we've now also got board assurance statements from each of these systems. Boards have been fully briefed. We've asked for recovery actions for each of these boards to go through and be discussed in board meetings. And we've also provided information that looks at variation for each of these boards to have a real focus on, I guess. And so it comes back to the point about how are we providing information around variation at a board level that enables actionable insight. So that's the approach that we've taken this year and we continue to take. The other thing that we're doing is, I don't know how others have felt, but sometimes at this time of the year, as Jim's described, we pivot to the new year, and it's almost like this year is done. So we are absolutely working with those teams that have gone off track to make sure the run rate doesn't deteriorate. So we have to keep that pace as we go into next year. And then from a rewards and incentives perspective, we've also tracked back, because I know the board have challenged me about the withholding of DSF, for example, and the residual DSF that we've... yes, sorry. Sorry, Bren. Deficit support funding. Essentially what we've done is the deficit support funding that had to be earned during the year, and our principle hasn't changed. This is a rules-based system. We are redistributing that to those providers and systems that have delivered, but we've also recognised that in a number of places a provider might be in a system where they've delivered, but the system hasn't delivered itself. So we are recognising that good performance. So we're trying to do that in a very level-handed way. And then from a capital position, when you read the capital, please don't get distressed about the level of underspend at this time of year. I've got good assurance now. We did an exercise at month 9. I think this underspend currently is as a consequence of the fact that we've been doing annual capital planning, and we're just about to pivot to 4-year allocations. So I have on good authority now, with a lot of work, that we will probably underspend our capital budget by 39 million in aggregate across the group. It's 14 billion in total, so that's quite tight management. So I would say, incredibly well done to everybody out there. Let's not always spend our capital in the last quarter. I actually remember it from the monitor days, actually, that this used to happen. And then just finally, if I may, a massive shout out to the finance community. So this year, in October, we introduced and moved to ISFE2. I'm really pleased to say...
What's that mean?
This is the integrated finance system that that NHS England, all ICBs and CSUs use.
You're losing money by the pound, Elizabeth, going in my pot for 3-letter and a half.
Sorry.
I'm going to have a charging system.
I'm going to say sorry, Glenn, Bren, every time it happens. But a massive shout out to the team. So this was a massive exercise. I'm pleased to say we've just come out of hypercare, so things are working well. And then the other thing that probably went unnoticed to the board was we have a financial reporting system that provides all of this information. It collects all the planning data. In the middle of collecting various plans and monthly reportings, we've actually moved to a new financial reporting system. I wouldn't say it's gone without any glitches, but I'm pleased to say that we navigated that in a 6-week window after considerable efforts by all of the teams. So we now feel, from a cyber risk perspective, we're in a much better place. So lots of things going on behind the scenes to ensure that the quality of the financial information coming through to you, we can have confidence in.
Okay, great, thank you, very helpful. I realised I was a bit remiss in the last item, David, that Andrew made the point about having more productivity metrics in the performance report, which I think would be good to do, and then we could ideally see how it links then to overall financial performance.
Yeah, I know, Penny, you've asked for Andy to come to the next, Andy Haldane to come to the next meeting.
Yeah.
So we do provide very, very detailed monthly productivity packs to all the providers, which are available to all the board. And I believe that Karen Smith is actually sending them out to MPs as well.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah. Sam?
Yeah, rightly a lot of focus on the acute. I suppose I'm fast forwarding a year's time and asking the question, how will we see financially the evidence of the left shift, neighbourhoods, digital, and the prevention that's within our gift in the NHS?
Yeah. Don't take that.
Yeah. So I'm going to give you an answer that's not just from a finance person. So I have expressed to Penny, I'm a bit frustrated in that everyone's asking for the evidence of left shift to be through the money. And we will see that, and we're already seeing it when we talk about planning later today. You'll start to see that. but I also think we need to measure the outcomes and not get into the trap of good outcomes is just because we're spending more money. So what I'm looking for, I think, is that we spend money effectively across all parts of the sector to drive improved outcomes and to improve our mortality metrics or whatever else that we're talking about. So I agree that there will be some things we will naturally want to pay attention to, but it mustn't be the only thing.
Yeah, I think there may be. I think let's not get into it now because it could be quite a long conversation. But I think there's a piece about how we look at, which would go below the system level financial data to say how are the different bits within any system working. Because I think Sam's point, it goes systems and then provider trust. It doesn't have, for example, what. How do we think our performance is looking across GP practices? We have some measures, but so I think there is something we could look at around all of this, and then how are we going to assess neighbourhood provision? Is it working efficiently and effectively?
Yeah, and we have also obviously the payment policy groups as well that's looking at that. Sorry if that sounded defensive. It's just I keep being asked the same question, and from my previous role, I'm really keen to see the outcomes and that we're spending every penny more productively, more wisely, more efficiently.
Which will be the healthcare value equation. Right, I've got a few hands up now and we're slightly limited for time, so I'm going to be quite focused. So I've got Glenn, I've got Andrew, and I've got Paul. I'll just take those three.
I'll be quick, Chair. So, I mean, just that's not an easy thing to track would be one of my main answers on that. Even in an acute setting, there's increasingly a lot of our clinical staff are doing work that is about left shift. So if you take elderly care physicians, for example, they're spending a lot of time actually outreaching into primary care, also advice and guidance. So we will see a lot of left shift taking place, but it could still appear to be spent in an acute setting.
Andrew?
So my point's on deficit support for next year. So is it shrinking, Elizabeth?
Yeah.
And do you feel we've got the right incentives? Because where we've withdrawn money, I'm slightly worried that people give up, given that the quantum is so big in some of the bigger systems here. So it's just a reflection really around, are we pitching this right and creating the right kind of motivation here to get into a balanced position?
Do you want to take that one and then we'll have Paul's question?
Yeah, sure. So on the deficit support funding as part of the 10-year health plan, we agreed that we would withdraw it at a pace that would take us about 3 years. So that's the rate that we're taking it. For some, and obviously there will be some challenged providers or systems, I think that will be 3 to 5 years. So we might need to course correct. I absolutely agree, though. We've got to give people a reasonable chance to get to break even, otherwise people will naturally give up. People will push to get to break even, they'll stretch. But in all of the instances where we're withdrawing deficit support funding, in parallel we're tracking that there are opportunities to make change at the pace that the deficit support funding is coming out.
Okay, that's fair.
Paul?
Just linking this discussion about the success of this year with the money, the previous discussion around variation, and the variation obviously with the money this year has diminished, and so there is a series of experiences, and Andrew went through the list of the ICBs that had successfully come to stop deficits this year. I think at the beginning of the year they wouldn't have believed that was possible. So around the country, there are people that have done things with your support that they didn't believe was possible. This year, we are facing people wanting to do things in a whole range of areas, not money, that they don't think is possible. I think those people that have done something now, because of your help, we should ask them, what is it that's happened? Because they are now doing something they didn't believe was possible. And next year, we're going to want a lot of people to do things they don't believe are possible today.
Yeah. So, I don't know, Jeremy or Mark want to comment, but we had a CFO event, and I know Jeremy was there for able to make the whole day as well.
Finance Officer.
Chief Finance Officer.
She's getting hard.
Sorry, yes, one of those events. And we picked individuals and systems and providers across the country that had made the biggest step change, and they still weren't perfect, but you could see this rate of improvement that was really stepped. And what was interesting was I specifically picked not the usual suspects. And it was fantastic, really, really good. And I think I've had the most amount of response from a CFO event because it wasn't the usual suspects. Don't get me wrong, we rely on our usual suspects as well, and they're doing a fantastic job. But where you have providers, I won't name them, but providers and individuals that have moved their agency budgets that were £10 million a year to £400,000 a year, and their staff survey results have been maintained. They didn't improve because I tried to triangulate as well at the staff and patient experience on this. Then I think that was something and a learning for everyone else. And that individual, not only did they get the kudos actually of they were probably somebody that people didn't know, everyone's gone to see how did you do it. And I think the more we can do that, I think it's incredible.
We can write that down.
Yeah.
My observation would be, being at the conference, a couple of things. First of all, the financial metrics weren't delivered at the cost of other metrics, so both can be done. And I think one of the recurring themes was how the finance directors were working with the chief executives in the way that Elizabeth and Jim have worked. That it's a joint plan. So rather than finance happening over here and then headcount over here and then the patient delivery somewhere else, actually having a joint plan. I think the key issue for this year then is what's the joint agenda? It's a pretty tricky year. How do Jim and Elizabeth communicate that out, and then how does that agenda get shared with all the chief execs and the finance directors across the country to deliver that? But I think it's two themes for this year that have been less recurrent in previous years is the FDs delivering their plan with the chief executives, and it's been a joint agenda.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Right, let's move on. So, Sarah Jane, we're coming on to Emergency Preparedness, Resilience and Response Assurance Report. I think you should take this as read, but are there any specific things you just want to flag?
Just briefly, Penny, if I may, thank you. So it's an increasingly complex, volatile world, and we've got new and emerging risks that we're having to manage through. With permission, and I'll have to keep saying EPRR, otherwise I'm going to extend the item.
That one you can
we've
have.
explained what it is. Okay, that we need to manage through, and that means strengthening our governance and our coordination and our partnership working both as NHS England and obviously through down into the NHS, and the tripartite arrangement that we have with the Department of Health and Social Care and the UK Health Security Agency is particularly important in this. The most significant risk that we continue to face is a pandemic. We've obviously got the learning from COVID-19 modules emergent, and we are fully cognizant of those. But we've also undertaken an exercise for a different kind of pandemic. It was called Exercise Pegasus at the end of last year, and we've been bringing the learning together from that with the learning from COVID in terms of highlighting our areas of vulnerability moving forwards. Beyond that, it is cyber. Mark touched on that in his report. That's our next most substantial risk, and it is increasingly how long these cyber incidents last for. The initial business continuity, we often need to expand out for month periods now, and we're also increasingly having to deal with resilience of some of our suppliers and partner organisations. We've got a cyber incident ongoing at the moment related to one of the organisations that we procure a lot of supplies from. Just then briefly, things that we've managed this year. There's a whole range of things we've listed in the report, from a 111 outage, which went down on a Saturday morning, and we had no 111 system for several hours, and one can only imagine the chaos that ensued from that. We've also supported the evacuation of children from Gaza back to the UK for treatment, managed several rounds of industrial action, and of course we'll need to do that again, and we've got this live incident with
striker ongoing. And then finally, the paper just sets out how we've approached the assurance process down through the NHS. So this has been run through all organisations. They've had to assess themselves against a variety of standards that have then been overseen by the regions, and where there are any gaps in assurance, there are action plans that have been followed up at their own board or through the local resilience forums. But we're constantly testing and pushing the standards within that report, and that's something that the board felt very strongly on last year, particularly around cyber. So we adjusted this year's framework to ask the question about resilience for a 6-month period, whereas previously people had often answered the question about could you deal with a 72-hour incident by means of example. So we're very, very busy in this world, and I don't foresee, unfortunately, that that's going to be different as we go into the next 12 months.
Sam?
So I increasingly talk about the left shift. So in blood pressure, helping patients to measure their own blood pressure is an example. Where I come from in Norway, each household has a whole raft of things that it collects to create the resilience in any emergency. So my question is, what are we doing in this item in terms of what I would call the left shift in terms of supporting patients to be resilient?
Okay, let me just add one amendment to that, or one addition to that, a bit the same but slightly different. How do we assure ourselves that through making sure that we have assurance around continued service delivery in these particular areas, that we don't end up inadvertently deteriorating health by not focusing on the interventions that would improve overall health outcomes, some of which may be around supporting individuals more, some of which may be around good primary care and so on, so that we're keeping an eye on the long term as well as the short term.
Yeah. Sorry.
Sorry, Duncan.
Oh.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Could you give me one? I could answer that. It'd be great after the previous two.
Capital off. Right. Penny, I was reflecting Sarah Jane's comment on, we've obviously had module 3 of the COVID inquiry, and I just, in terms of for this board, where we make sure we really kick the tyres on the actions that are coming out of that, and because to the last question's point, that kind of lessons learned around focus, and I just think there's something about us really making sure we emphasise that.
I think we need to bring that back very explicitly to a future discussion.
And specifically answering that question is if people and their carers did not take the tests during COVID, the nation would still have it. And so we depended upon human beings and their carers to do that testing. And so the resilience of that is a crucial part of the resilience. So that is, in a sense, answer the question about we can increase primary care and people's own resilience, because it's going to be an essential part of any pandemic.
Paul?
Two things. One, just to note that yesterday the government's new pandemic preparedness strategy was published.
Okay.
So I think it's worth us being aware of that.
Right.
The second thing is I wasn't quite sure, Penny, if you were suggesting an implied trade-off of what we're paying attention to. I think my reflection, maybe building on Paul's point, is that from the last pandemic, had we gone into that pandemic with a better underlying health of the population, would have come out of it a lot better. And so I think to those, from that perspective at least, that those two things should dovetail.
Okay, so I think one question is, which where Duncan started and Paul's gone, and a little bit of mine, let's take to another meeting when we look at the COVID inquiry and what's that mean and how do we think about it. So let's have that as a specific agenda item. I think for here and now, Sarah Jane, I think Sam recognises probably a hard one to answer, but Sam's underlying bit is, do we look at wider society preparedness for particular emergencies? I'm happy that my one we pick up through that review from the COVID inquiry.
Sure. So, first way to answer it is we've definitely shifted. I'm not sure we've left yet, but this has definitely been a year where we've spent a lot more time on primary and community resilience. And in one of our big learnings from Exercise Pegasus was that there was an ability to use community response a lot more than we were able to do because it wasn't scaled and ready to go. So we are definitely putting more energy into thinking about the resilience of out of hospital and how we build some of those escalation systems. We do, though, work very closely with the tripartite arrangement, as I mentioned, with Department of Health and Social Care and the Health Security Agency, but also Cabinet Office and cross-government, just looking at broader resilience planning, which does take those sorts of things into account. So I sit as part of a group that's assessing all of the wider societal response. We look at all different sorts of issues, not just related to health, but other things that could have a big impact as well. So the partnership working of this is really important, and one of the reflections as we go into new DHSC, I think, is the sort of clearer what's an absolute responsibility now of NHS England to do in this space, as opposed to other agencies across government. That's one of the things that we're holding in balance all the time. Certainly in the the meningitis B, I was very clear that the NHS was there to respond to the decisions that were made in the other parts of the partnership, and we would take them away and make them happen. So it's just getting that right balance between our own part of that. Then just in terms of there's a few bits on the tracking as things emerge. So we immediately scan them for actions that we need to take in the here and now if there's particularly high risk things that we need to address, and then we also sort of put a marker down for things where we need to do a more strategic piece of work. So there's some really live things at the moment, like our accuracy of the way we report mask, people's fit for a mask, for example, which is something we need to do better on in the here and now. There's another thing which is much bigger that came out of Pegasus, for example, where we really could not surge our intensive care capacity for children beyond around 200%, which is still pretty good. And there isn't an easy answer to the way that we would do that, because if there was an easy answer, we'd be operating at a very, very low utilisation figure day in, day out. And we need to take some more strategic decisions around whether we're happy to operate with that sort of risk or not. So there's a transactional response and there's that more sort of strategic response, and how much risk that we are collectively happy to carry.
Okay. All right, thank you. So we've now got a few things which are for information. We won't spend time on those, but I would ask colleagues to make sure that they have read all of those. And the final item for today is a number of questions from the public. So I'm going to read those out and ask colleagues to respond to them. So the first one, I think either David, you or Meghana. Meghana, you taking it? Yeah. Okay. How does NHS England assure itself that its oversight arrangements can distinguish isolated clinical error from potential executive-level concealment, where trust leadership has acknowledged systemic complaints failures but denied duty of candour breaches in cases of admitted negligence, and what routes exist for patients to escalate concerns involving alleged misconduct by senior trust leaders beyond internal processes?
Thank you, Chair. So concerns about the conduct of chief executives or senior trust members should be raised with the chair of that organisation in the first instance. If the recipient of that response is not happy with the response, then they should escalate that. If that's a complaint, then to the Health Service Ombudsman. Concerns about alleged criminal behaviour should be reported to the police, whilst concerns about potential provider breaches of Regulation 20, which is duty of candour, should be raised with the Care Quality Commission, who are the appropriate regulator. It's not NHS England's role to investigate individual patients' complaints, nor to generally investigate concerns about individual senior trust members, but where such concerns are raised with NHS England will consider whether they indicate broader governance concerns about how the trust is run by the board. NHS England can and does use proportionate assurance reviews, provider licence oversight, fit and proper person scrutiny, and where appropriate, independent external reviews to understand whether concerns indicate isolated errors or potential leadership level concealment.
Okay, thank you, Meghana. And I just wonder, Rob, this is probably for you. I think we make sure that those processes are clearly set out on our website, because we have quite a few questions about what is the right process that people need to go through, and it would be helpful if that was there.
We're just in the process of tidying the website up, so I'll make sure that happens. No
Okay,
problem.
thank you very much.
And Penny, linked to that, some clarity around whistleblowing and where whistleblowers go would be helpful. I think there's some confusion out there. So what happens if your own trust doesn't respond positively to an issue? What do you do next?
Yeah. Okay, that would be very helpful. So the next one is for Claire. We have received several questions about prescribing
Liothyronine.
And you can tell us what it's for. Mainly focused on 2 points. How will NHS England resolve the misalignment contradiction between our policies and ensuring that guidance is clinically coherent and consistently implemented by all ICBs? And what steps will NHS England take to address persistent ICB non-compliance and ensure that patients receive equitable access where it is clinically indicated?
So thank you, Penny. So liothyronine is a medication used in some thyroid conditions. So NHS England have policy guidance and prescribing advice on liothyronine, which reflects NICE recommendations and the evidence that we have on liothyronine. That guidance recommends that liothyronine should not be routinely prescribed because it is not clinically or cost effective, but sets out the exceptions where it may be an appropriate consideration for prescribers. The policy position is kept under review with clinical leads who continue to advise that the evidence remains unchanged and the policy should continue as it is. NHS England expects that commissioners and prescribers will act with due regard to the advice provided by NHS England. As part of the new operating model, regions will have oversight of commissioner and provider performance, including access to high quality care and reduction in health inequalities.
Thank you. Very clear. And then for Amanda, doctors have a professional duty under the General Medical Council guidance to refer patients to specialist care where this is in the patient's best interests. The forthcoming general practice contract introduces additional requirements prior to referral. Can the board confirm whether NHS England has formally engaged with the General Medical Council on how these contractual requirements interact with that professional duty and whether any joint risk assessment or patient safety review has been undertaken to ensure GPs are not placed in conflict between their contractual and professional obligations?
So GP's clinical decision to refer is unchanged in the new contract, which comes into effect on the 1st of April. Nothing in the new contract changes their responsibility to act in their patient's best interest. There's no new contractual barriers to referral. GPs can refer exactly as they always have, and claims about new hurdles aren't correct. The changes actually relate to secondary care and the way in which referrals are triaged, not to GP obligations to act. Expanding advice and guidance simply means that patients will get faster consultant-led decisions and clearer next steps, rather than putting any sort of barrier into the process by which they get referred. The GMC isn't involved in contractual matters, so no formal engagement has taken place with the GMC, and that's because their role is as a professional regulator, and there is no conflict between what's in the contract and the professional duty of GPs.
Thank you. And then Duncan, we've received a couple of questions related to trusts operating without compliant single-sex facilities and maintaining policies that are suggested to be inconsistent with the Equality Act of 2010, citing tribunal findings, requests for policy review in 2025 and evidence of patient and staff safety risks. Can the board explain what action NHS England has taken to ensure legal compliance across trusts, why previous requests to review relevant policies were declined, and how it is assuring itself that staff and patient safety is not being compromised?
Thanks, Penny. So the couple of questions we've had obviously cover kind of a linked but separate issues of single-sex facilities for staff and same-sex accommodation for patients. So in relation to staff facilities, which was the issue under consideration in the recent employment tribunal involving County Durham and Darlington NHS Foundation Trust, NHS England does not issue guidance for the system on this. It's for local organisations to design their own policies and based on the relevant legislation. In terms of patient accommodation, NHS England does provide national guidance to support delivery of the NHS Constitution Pledge. And as I said at the last board meeting, NHS England has been reviewing this and all relevant policies and procedures to ensure they're aligned with the Supreme Court ruling. However, it's important that the Equality and Human Rights Commission, that's the EHRC, updated code of practice for services, public functions and associations, which sets out the legal framework for how services are delivered in line with the Equality Act, is available before final decisions about national policies are taken. The updated code of practice will be published shortly, subject to parliamentary approval, and updated any guidance for the NHS will be available following that. We are continuing to discuss with ministers in the Department of Health and Social Care to ensure that NHS organisations have a clear national steer on these issues as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you. And then the final question for Fiona. Phase 1 of the NHS call list, which was launched in February of this year, introduced nationally agreed pricing frameworks to improve uptake and savings through the NHS supply chain. Can the board set out how learning from Phase 1 will inform the prioritisation and design of future call list categories, including the role that ease of implementation will play, how suppliers can propose existing framework products with significant recurrent savings for inclusion, and how NHS England assures that cost-driven product choices, including those used for pre-operative skin preparation, continue to meet appropriate regulatory licensing and patient safety standards.
Thank you, Penny. A few questions there. So I'll start with how we learn from Phase 1 of the core list. So feedback has already been gathered from key stakeholders, both internal and external. And I think what's really important here is that we're currently refreshing how this programme is going to work. That will ensure that this core list is underpinned by the robust processes and established timescales that will enable the scaling and broadening to deliver greater value whilst managing the risk. And we're embedding those processes into the core activity, working closely with supply chain. These learnings are also going to be applied using this resilience and simplification, and we can share those more broadly. In terms of how we are going to ensure that this is used for future phases, this will be worked up with clinical colleagues, suppliers and NHS partners. And in the long-term ambition, it's really to look at how many we can bring in safely. But I think most importantly, it's looking at product categories that will offer opportunities to rationalise the range, remove the unwarranted variation we've heard a lot about today, but also to drive value where there are low barriers. Lastly, I think in terms of how these insights can really be signposted for suppliers, I think we have ongoing market engagement and we will continue to evolve to have one single entry point for suppliers and customers as we move forwards. The last part of your question was actually specifically around products that contain active antiseptic ingredients that are intended for pre-operative skin preparation. These are defined as medical products and therefore they must hold the appropriate Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency approval and authorisation for that purpose. We work closely with the Royal College of Surgeons and the MHRA joint statement on how these products can be used clearly and signposted and licensed for their intent. Therefore, NHS England provides system-level assurance through the NHS Standard Contract, National Infection Prevention Standards, clinical guidance and procurement frameworks, all of which set clear expectations that NHS trusts use clinical products that are safe, clinically appropriate and compliant with regulatory requirements.
Okay, great. It's quite an useful prompt that we should probably have an item on procurement and supply chains at a future meeting, and also perhaps think about how we look at that in terms of performance. Might be something to come back to. Okay, any other business from anyone? Right. Jolly good. Thank you all very much. Well prepared. Look forward to the next time. And thank you to members of the public. Thank you.